these three staff notes, as they call, produced by the IMF over the last couple of years, and they focus on how to basically integrate climate adaptation into fiscal policy. Fiscal policy, as we know, is worrying about tax revenues, expenditure, and how economic development is managed, sustained, or driven by governments. And there are economic principles for doing this in terms of integrating adaptation to climate change into fiscal policy. As we said before, worrying about the cost benefits economics of adaptation is going to be very critical, because you obviously don't have enough resources to keep on putting money into adaptation. There are always risks and benefits to be looked at. There may be sometimes places where adaptation is simply not possible, and then people are either forced to move or they are left behind, and they have to just face up to the consequences of not listening to the government, and so on and so forth. So this is the first of the reports, and I'm going to just very briefly read the top messages, because it's a lot of text. Because they are staff notes, they are just text upon text upon text, and in a classroom you wouldn't read so much text. But since this is a podcast on YouTube, just to give you a sense of what this includes, what this involves, and what the economic principles are. And these documents are online that you can open and read, download and read, if you want to follow up on these. So keeping that in mind, just be sure that I'm being incredibly brief. So in terms of the summary of the economic principles for integrating climate adaptation into fiscal policy, adaptation to climate change is a necessity for advanced and developing economies alike. Everybody is in this now, and nobody is invincible to climate impacts. Policymakers face the challenge of facilitating this transition. We looked at this in the principles in the previous series of podcasts on how governments need to worry about helping people and firms to adapt and deal with residual risks and develop policies. This note argues that adaptation to climate change should be part of a holistic development strategy involving both private and public sector responses. So IMF, the International Monetary Fund itself, is responsible for monitoring global economic systems, identifying risks, and advising governments on economic development pathways, and also sometimes offer loans to deal with issues like Pakistan right now negotiated a deal to get some funds from the IMF and so on. So this is very distinct from the World Bank, as the report that we read was from the World Bank, right? Governments can prioritize public investment in adaptation programs with positive externalities, address market imperfections and policies that make private adaptation inefficient, and mobilize revenues for and distribute the benefits of adaptation. Externalities are things that are not directly related, but they end up impacting. If you're worrying about economic policies for integrating adaptation into climate change, then there may be other factors that are not directly related to your adaptation and your fiscal policies, but they need to be considered because they impact the cost of your adaptation, and the economic principles have to worry about that. So it's in a kind of approximate way. Okay? Things that are not directly related but cannot be ignored. Although the choices of what should be done and at what cost ultimately depends on each society's preferences, economic theory provides a useful framework to maximize the impact of public spending. So public spending is necessary, but you want to make sure the bang for the buck is at its best. Cost-benefit analysis, complemented by the analysis of distributional effects, can be used to prioritize adaptation programs as well as all other development programs to promote an efficient and just transition to a changed climate, and changing climate, of course, while compensations may be needed to offset damages that are either impossible or too expensive to abate, as we said before. Subsidies for adaptation require careful calibration to prevent excessive risk taking. So, for example, continuing to build along coastlines knowing that sea levels are rising and maybe cyclones are increasing and inundation, storm surge, etc. are going to be problematic. In the meantime, mangroves have been decimated, natural buffers have been destroyed, and so on. Then the risk has to be carefully considered in this case. Well, compensation may be possible and needed, but it may be beyond compensable at some point. Okay, whatever that word, compensatable maybe. Okay, so framing adaptation to climate change, this is more generic in terms of what we have already learned. Adaptation is needed in all countries and can be macro critical, means large scale adaptations are needed. Climate is changing and will continue to change even with intensive mitigation efforts. So the entire IPCC process assessment reports have focused a lot on mitigation and emission pathways and socio-economic pathways that we have discussed elsewhere in multiple places. You can look them up. But this they are all based on technological feasibilities, economic feasibilities, and assumptions of technological promises of bioenergy, carbon capture and sequestration, etc. So even if we are very diligent and successful in pursuing these pathways and keeping the warmings to below 2 degrees C, or God forbid even 1.5 degrees C, I don't think it'll happen, but even then you will have climate change impacts. Mitigation has limited effect on sea level rise until mid-century. So no matter what we do, we have already put in so much greenhouse gases into the atmosphere that the melting of the glaciers, warming of the oceans, so the steric expansion of the ocean and contributions from melting glaciers is going to continue, and sea level rise will go on till mid-century. So these are called irreversible effects. Even if we start mitigating furiously and keep the warming at 2 degrees C or below, well below 2 degrees C, glaciers that are melting will not be rebuilt so fast. That takes geologic time scales. So that's what we are talking about. All countries will be affected and are already being affected. So even US and Europe have been hammered in the last few summers and winters in terms of climate impacts, extremes, droughts, floods, wildfires, hurricanes, etc. So all countries will be affected, and lower income and small vulnerable nations face the largest challenges, even if they are responsible for a tiny fraction of cumulative emissions. So we know that cumulative emissions are what are causing the warming. There is a very close relation between cumulative carbon and warming. So anywhere at any time you add another gigaton of carbon, it's going to cause certain amount of warming. But this has mostly come from developed world, the North America and Europe, and to some extent Australia, but the global south or the developing countries are now the most vulnerable in terms of climate impacts. Climate change adaptation is the process needed to minimize losses and maximize benefits from climate change. This is the definition that was used in IPCC. Climate adaptation is not entirely new because individuals, firms and societies have adapted to a wide range of climates. Farmers, for example, each season are adapting to changing amounts of rainfall and temperatures and so on and so forth. So people have an intrinsic sense of adapting to a small range of changes in environmental variables. Now we are talking about going into no analog states, things that individuals, firms and societies have not seen before, and this is where adaptation is critical in terms of climate change adaptation. With climate change, individuals, firms and societies have to reconsider and update how adapted they are to present and future conditions. So can we constantly upgrade adaptation plans and strategies and implementations? Not really, but many times you have to learn by doing and at least try as hard as possible to avoid maladaptation and look at residual risks. For example, if Mumbai is expected to get 2 meters of sea level rise by 2100, there is no way it has the finances to protect itself against 2 meters of sea level rise. So it'll do the best with its financial resources, and then there is residual risk if the sea level goes beyond what they have protected themselves against. Okay. At its core, climate change adaptation requires a constant and dynamic readjustment of consumption, production, and public policies. This is kind of a general statement, but we already know that despite 25 years of negotiations, human lifestyle continues in terms of consumption, production, and public policies, especially in terms of nationally determined contributions, are not keeping up. Emissions continue to go up. So whether we are really capable of such behavioral change, or whether there will come a time when we will get hit so hard that we will be forced to make drastic changes in our consumption, production, and then have policies, that has to be seen yet. Okay, governments in every country can help by prioritizing adaptation policies with positive externalities, by removing the market imperfections and policies that hinder efficient private adaptation, and by ensuring a just transition. So we are going to be forced to transition, maybe in terms of to a new way of life, in terms of socio-technical transitions of energy, lifestyles, crop selections, etc., consumption, production, etc. So this has to be just. The transition has to be just, in the sense the most vulnerable ones are protected, as well, as we saw in the previous broadcast based on the World Bank report. Let's just read this, what we mean by positive externalities. Individuals and firms have strong incentives to adapt because many adaptation benefits tend to be local and private. So you benefit from the adaptation, so it's not just a cost, there is a benefit. Therefore, progress on adaptation is not affected by coordination problems such as progress on mitigation is. Mitigation is a global thing. You're worrying about global concentrations of CO2 and other greenhouse gases. However, there is a clear role for governments when adaptation has large externalities. Market inefficiencies and policy failures may also limit private adaptation or create distortion. Okay, so distortions. Poor countries may not be able to afford adaptations needed for for a just transition to a new climate. Implying international support would be necessary to support entire countries' adaptation, especially small and vulnerable developing economies. If Pakistan gets hit with a national level flood with massive disasters, which happened last year in 2022, and now they are facing serious bankruptcy issues, then how does the global community take care of this situation? There are instruments being developed like loss and damage, which have a long way to go, but still this is something that cannot be avoided or kicked down the road for too long. Ensuring efficient and just adaptation can be macro critical in many countries because adaptation can greatly reduce impacts, costs, and inequalities caused by climate change. The goal also here is that the entire global system is only as resilient to climate change as each member country is, because there have been instances of climate displacements, climate migrations, and maybe even geopolitical perturbations, let's say in terms of terrorism, if not every country is made climate resilient and given help to adapt to climate change and manage their resources like food, water, energy, etc. Adaptation can also be macro critical because investment needs may be large, especially in small vulnerable economies. Okay, for example, infrastructure to protect coasts against future sea level rise is estimated to cost from 1 to 10% of GDP annually during the construction phase in some small developing states. So countries like small island states are very, very worried about this, especially because they are sitting ducks as sea level rises all around them, and they literally begin to lose real estate and fisheries and sit there and wait for storms to come and destroy them and so on. and they are not majorly responsible for the warming and the impacts that are happening. Additional international support is needed as many lower income countries face high adaptation needs while being challenged by limited fiscal space, limited capacity, or both. Their entire tax revenue and expenditure system is very limited, and they don't have much of an opportunity to grow either, to manage the ever-growing climate impacts and the adaptation needs. Despite all the potential benefits, adaptation cannot replace mitigation. So as we say in the cliche, mitigation is about trying to avoid the unmanageable, whereas adaptation is trying to manage adaptation is trying to manage the unavoidable, and mitigation is trying to avoid the unmanageable. Okay, so I hope I said it right. So let me leave this first podcast here, and we'll come back and look at some more economic principles. As you can see, there is a lot of text and I'm not reading all of it, but the reports, as I said, are online. You can definitely go back and read them if any particular bullet point really interests you. Okay, so I'll keep these brief just because I'm not an economics expert anyways, but I hope to provide enough of an introduction by just reading of these bullets from the 3 staff notes from IMF. Okay, so let me stop this here and come back and move to the next aspect in the next podcast.